And joining me to discuss what's happening on the ground in the United States of America, what are the grounds for these deportations and revocations, and the panic mode that Indian community, students in America really are in. I'm being joined for all this and more by Alexander Holtzman. He's Director, Deportation Defense Clinic. Alexander, thank you so much for joining us on, on the network. The fact that last time when we were speaking, we were talking about what happens if there is a scenario such as this. Now, I'm talking to you when it is happening as we speak. Let's begin with Suri's case. His deportation has been halted for now, but what are the grounds on which he can actually stay back in the United States of America and not really be deported since he is married to an American of Palestinian origin and has a child too?
Yes, thank you for having me. I believe 3 children, if I read correctly. So part of his argument for remaining in the United States will first be responding to the charging document in immigration court called a notice to appear. I've yet to see that document, but if it's similar to the charging document in Mr. Mahmoud Khalil's case, it's likely that they will charge Mr. Suri with violating the Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 237. The specific provision that Mr. Khalil was charged with, at least, was 237A4CI. And basically what that says is that the Secretary of State, in this case Marco Rubio, would have designated Mr. Suri as an individual who's done something adverse to the foreign policy consequences of the United States. I think that is likely to be a dubious charge, and I suspect his attorney will first and foremost review the charging document to see that if ICE can sustain the charges that they've issued against Mr. Suri.
Legally speaking, Alexander, where does this move from here? Can people who are being charged, detained, and then becoming or being put in the deportable category, can they really go to court, and will that hold, or can the White House overturn a court judgment?
So the answer to your last question is no. The White House cannot overturn a court judgment. And in fact, there are serious concerns about the rule of law currently in the United States, with the Trump administration flouting another court order recently with respect to not deporting Venezuelans. A judge appointed by George W. Bush halted deportations in that case, but those Venezuelans were subsequently deported to El Salvador nonetheless. And the judge is currently requiring the Department of Justice to explain why they did not follow a court order. And I suspect this will be an ongoing question with the Trump administration following court orders.
Right, but that's also very interesting, Alexander, because we've seen a judge take a very serious note, halt the deportation of Badr Suri, but then we also saw President Trump come out and say that these are all left-wing judges who need to go. Very strong, harsh statements coming from White House, from none other than the president. So this is, again, a fight that we saw in the past as well, judiciary versus the executive.
Yeah, so there's certainly rhetoric coming out of the executive branch with respect to the judiciary branch. In a somewhat unusual move, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Roberts, issued a statement recently seeming to contradict those statements made from the executive branch, and making clear that impeachment, for example, is not the mechanism where you criticize a judge or a judge's order, absent very limited circumstances, but instead the regular appellate process, appealing the case up to the Court of Appeals or ultimately to the U.S. Supreme Court, is how you fight a case if you disagree with a judge's ruling. So, you know, absolutely there's statements being made currently by this administration. Again, just to emphasize, you know, the judge in the case I referred to earlier was appointed by George W. Bush, certainly not, you know, a left-wing activist, for example. You know, John Roberts, of course, as well, you know, was appointed by a Republican president as the Chief Justice. And so, you know, I think, frankly, these cases are political opportunities to target and try to suppress free speech. And I suspect that those arguments will be made primarily in federal court, likely for these respondents.
Okay, then Alexander, coming to the very important aspect about green cards and visas, the sanctity of a green card, an individual being very confident of holding a green card, now no longer stands because the administration, it seems, is now scrutinizing every word you've said, every street you've walked with or supported a protest somewhere, even if it's a very peaceful protest, and what you've said on social media. So, how fearful should Indian students or Indian green card holders be? How are they being scrutinized? What will the process look like?
So I am concerned about academic freedom, about the right to free speech based on these actions by the executive branch. When you win a green card in the US, you obtain what's called lawful permanent resident status, which means that that status should be permanent. Now, the card, the actual green card, expires every 10 years, but you can file to just renew the card like you would, with kind of other cards, for example, a driver's license in the United States. But your status as an LPR, a lawful permanent resident, does not expire. However, it's absolutely concerning that Mr. Khalil has been charged, detained, is at risk of losing his green card based on his exercising his free speech under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And of course, as in this case with Mr. Suri, that he's at risk of losing his student visa. Unfortunately, in some views, the U.S. government executive branch has wide discretion to rescind, in this context, a student visa if the Secretary of State makes a designation that that individual's presence is adverse to the foreign policy interests of the United States. So I suspect in immigration court, that's somewhat of a challenging charge. However, in federal court, I think there are serious constitutional concerns regarding the right to free speech, the right to due process under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And I suspect that those claims will be litigated vigorously by attorneys in both of these cases, including, for example, there was a case in New York of a political activist, Mr. Ravi Rockbeer, who was pardoned at the end of the Biden administration, who ultimately brought suit in the Second Circuit, and a federal judge there found a constitutional right to, quote, say goodbye, because he had been in the U.S. for decades and then was detained without notice and separated from his family. And I suspect that somewhat similarly in these cases, that federal courts will slow down, as they already have, the deportation process to analyze the very serious constitutional questions at play.
Right. Alexander, before I let you go, because you have been working in this sphere, in this area, you have colleagues, friends who are working in this area. How many panic calls are you receiving? How many people who must have written something, students who must have written something supporting a Palestinian cause or any such, how many of them are actually calling to seek or to consult with you and people who work in this sphere?
My clinic, my deportation defense clinic at Hofstra Law School, receives calls almost every single day, whether it's from clients who are scared of being detained by ICE, individuals seeking representation in immigration court, and students have come to me as well and are worried about being doxxed, having their information shared online. And I think also academics and students may already be, or may in the future, self-censor out of fear that the U.S. government will retaliate against them. And I think these are exactly the intentions of these actions, is to target high-profile activists who the U.S. government can send a message that if you speak your mind and try to speak truth to power, that there can be serious consequences, particularly for non-citizens who would be vulnerable to these type of executive actions. So I think it's very concerning from an academic freedom standpoint, constitutional rights, and of course the civil and human rights of non-citizens visiting and living in the United States.
Right. I can tell you this from my experience. We've been trying to get in touch with a lot of students who are worried and concerned. Nobody wants to come on record. So that's how fearful they are in the United States of America today. Alexander Holtzman, thank you so much for joining us here on the network.
Thank you.